everyone. Thank you for joining us for a special live stream today. We are giving a sneak peek of some of our very anticipated keynote speakers at Digital Stratosphere. So we'll get to that in just a second and have our guests introduce themselves. I'm Kyler Cheatham, Global Marketing Director here at Third Stage Consulting Group. And I wanted to invite all of you to join us for our Digital Stratosphere event, which is happening next week. It is the 8th through the 10th. And you can head to stratosphere2022.com to register. And did I mention it is completely free? So please jump over there. If you can't join live, no problem. Every registrant will have the opportunity to get the recordings from each event, each keynote or panel or whatever you'd like to check out from our very packed agenda. So with that said, I am joined by CEO and founder of Third Stage, Eric Kimberling, and two of our sponsors of the event, Marcus Harris from Taft Law and Brad Feakes from Estes Group. So we're going to talk about their specific topics, which is contracting on Marcus's side or digital transformation. And then Brad is going to take us through some cloud migration strategies. So with that, we'll turn it over to Marcus. You want to give us a quick intro?
Yeah, thanks, Kyler. My name is Marcus Harris. I'm a software and intellectual property attorney at Taft, Stettinius, and Hollister here in their Chicago office. And I really focus my practice primarily on drafting and negotiating ERP-related, software implementation-related contracts, and then litigating those contracts when those projects go sideways, as they often do, and as we often talk about here with Eric and the rest of the team. But I'm excited to be here and excited to speak next week at Digital Stratosphere.
Excellent. We're excited to have you as well. Definitely, obviously, a very important piece of the overall digital transformation process. We talk about contracting in pretty much every guest we have on Ground Control or our Digital Stratosphere podcast. Brad, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you. So my name is Brad Feakes. I am with a company called the Estes Group. We are a cloud provider and managed IT service provider that serves the ERP community. So primarily the manufacturing and distribution areas. So started out, quick history of the company. We started out primarily as like an integrator consultancy. And as we evolved further, we came to understand that our customers' needs extended far beyond just the ERP system and had to do with the deployment and the integration of ERP with all these other systems in their world. So that's been kind of the evolution of our journey, and we'll be speaking about some topics about that this coming week.
Excellent. Well, let's jump in, and before we do, audience members, we are live on most all of our social media platforms, and we can see all of your questions. So please, first, so we know that you can actually see us, go ahead and drop your location in the comments so we know where our audience is joining us from. And if you do have any questions, again, we can see those live and we'll address them with our speakers here. So let's first start with you, Marcus. We had you on a few weeks back and just talking about the contracting phase of any sort of digital transformation. So I'm curious, we had a few other questions come up after our last ground control episode, and I thought I might ask you a few of those, and then we'll kind of turn it over to Brad as well, since we have kind of a broad group here with us today. So after your presentation, we had some questions regarding some best practices to make sure that the contracting phase at integrating with any vendor or anything like that, some best practices. So how do you make sure, what's the number one thing you would recommend to someone or an organization that's going into a digital transformation that wants to make sure their contract and then statement of work is really aligned and just tightened up to make sure they won't have any issues?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, and I think there's a variety of best practices. But really, I think the first thing that I would put out there, and then I'll follow up with a few more things that I think you should focus on. The first thing is really, to give your team, whether that's an in-house attorney, a contract specialist, contract negotiator that you utilize, or if you're utilizing somebody like me, an outside law firm, to give them the time to be able to properly review and to negotiate that contract and to focus on the things that are actually going to be important to you. The worst thing that you can do is just assume that the vendor's terms and conditions are reasonable or industry standard or market, so to speak, and sign them as is. The second worst thing that you can do is, really just assume that that contract negotiation process doesn't take very long. I've had clients that are doing multi-million-dollar software acquisitions, and they'll give me, 3 weeks to negotiate that contract from the beginning to the end. And while that sounds like a lot of time, it really isn't. I mean, you've got to go through these documents, and what vendors do today is you've got maybe a 5-page document that doesn't look particularly robust, that actually internally references all sorts of links that are outside of the contract, and those links in and of themselves could be 10 pages each, and there's 15 references in there. So what looks like a 5 to 7 page contract is actually approaching more than 100 pages, and there's multiple turns and multiple conversations that have to be had. So I think those are the two most important things that you've got to do, is take the time to negotiate it, and then take the time to actually negotiate it properly and understand the time and resource investment that really takes. So those are the biggest things.
Absolutely. And I know Eric and I kind of talked about it on ground control, but when we are talking about the timing for any sort of outside legal counsel, internal legal counsel, even, an executive team, how much time is the right time to start sort of reviewing those contracts?
Yeah, it's kind of dependent on the deal size and how critically important that particular piece of software is to your company. I think if you've got, what I would call kind of bet the company software integration, software implementation project going on, then I think certainly at least a month before the oftentimes illusory deadline that the vendor's giving you to sign it, you've got to get that into the hands of your attorney or your in-house team to really hope to do a proper job. I would say maybe even two months, because you have to understand. I mean, it takes a few days to really digest what you've got in front of you from a terms and conditions standpoint, and that's assuming you have nothing else going on, right? So a 3-day initial review of the contract. I've got to then prepare what I would call a point sheet that highlights all of the issues and concerns that I've got with them. Then you and I would have to have a substantive conversation to go over each one of those issues that I've highlighted, to make sure that you and I are on the same page as to what we're going to ask the vendor for regarding concessions. Because what I think is an issue may not be an issue for you at all. You may just not care about it. So that's all got to take a process, take time, and it's a process in and of itself. And then we've got to send the revised contract back to the other side. They've got to look at it. So each one of these turns is going to take probably about a week, I would think. So you can see where a month is really an aggressive timeline, and I think certainly a 2-month period of time is probably reasonable and probably something that makes a lot more sense.
Absolutely. Yep, definitely a way better answer than when I asked Eric on ground control about it a couple weeks ago, and he gave me the classic consultant answer of "it depends."
That's not a wrong answer.
Yeah, right. Absolutely. No. I kid, but that's all super important information, and I think it ties nicely together to the work that you do, Brad, when it comes to maybe transitioning from an on-premise solution to an ERP cloud option or anything like that when it comes to the solution. So can you take us through some considerations if you are an organization that is considering a cloud option or solution that might have some hesitancy about what that migration might look like?
Sure, for sure. And just to kind of dovetail back on Marcus's discussion, which was great. Marcus, it's great to meet you. You never know when you need a good lawyer, so this is beneficial in many ways. But I think one big piece, and whether this is you're looking to migrate to the cloud, work with an integrator to implement a system, or working within a referral partner network, I think it's really important that the expectations are clearly enunciated right out of the onset in terms of what the two parties are trying to get out of this relationship, right? Because what is a contract but an elaboration of a business relationship between two groups, and understanding what you're truly after and being really clear and open and on the table of these are the things that we want to try to get out of this, and being willing to kind of uncomfortably navigate your way through terminology and things that may not be in your bailiwick are extremely important, because everything we leave us is something eventually that becomes anger, for lack of a better term. Frustration is driven by the misunderstandings at the early stages of a relationship. So in terms of the cloud and the migration to the cloud, I think it's really important that you are clear about the things that you're trying to solve business-wise. What business problems are you trying to solve for your customers? Or if you're a customer, what problems are you yourself trying to solve? What pain points? What kinds of things are you contending with in your own business climate that you would need to be addressed by a given cloud solution? Because you certainly don't want to, if you need a pair of running shoes, you don't want to come home with a pair of winter boots, right? Winter boots are a great thing for one specific, utilization. But if you're looking for a pair of running shoes, you have to make sure you're asking the right questions as to, this is why I need this solution versus another. So it's now speaking from a vendor standpoint, my job is always to try to understand what the customer's needs are, and how we're best suited to help those needs. And if we're not, if these needs extend beyond what our capabilities are, it's important to be clear there to say, okay, these are things that you need. We may not be the right people to solve those problems. We may need to line you up with someone who can. So we run, as an integrator, we have certain expertise in certain softwares. When we run into things that are beyond our bailiwick and we can't, say, provide an impartial selection process, all right, I'd reach out to someone like Eric and say, Eric, we need an objective interlocutor to look at these needs of this business. And so I think that's kind of one of the key pieces there is that sense of clarity. So if you're a customer looking to migrate, you'd be trying to understand to yourself, what are the current challenges with what I have right now, be it server age, maintainability, staff, risk. Certainly cloud is tied to the perpetual ransomware threats that we're encountering. Am I in a situation where that is a threat and there's potential for the cloud to be a means of mitigating or mollifying that threat? So I'd say that's where you start with, is trying to understand what is the pain and understand kind of what the value you're trying to get out of that relationship.
Absolutely. Yeah, these audience comments are cracking me up. An ethical vendor, they called you, Brad.
Oh, don't say that too loud.
Yeah, right. And that brings me to another question when we talk about things like moving to the cloud and these emerging technologies, or emerging risks, we should say, when it comes to things like cybersecurity. And I'm curious, Marcus, when you are going through kind of that contracting with your vendor, do they have any sort of liability when it comes to cyber attacks, or is there any way you can kind of create more accountability on their end to make sure that you're protected as a customer?
Well, yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I think over the last 5 to 7 years, data security has become just a huge issue in all of these contracts. And every technology, or almost every technology-related contract, and especially these software integration and implementation agreements, they're going to contain a data security element to them. And so you've got to make sure that you understand how those liabilities play out from a legal perspective, and make sure that you account for them in the contract. Almost every one of these agreements today has something called a DPA, a data processing agreement, that has to comply with things like GDPR and CCPA, and depending on your jurisdiction, or depending on who your customers are to some extent even. So the short answer is absolutely, that has to be accounted for, and the liability and the responsibility needs to be placed, in my view, on the vendor, to the extent they're going to be processing what we call personally identifiable information. But it's got to be done in a reasonable way. And what I always tell my clients is, look, I can draft you an ironclad contract. And I think I've said this before. But the problem with that is, I can't shift all the risk of the business relationship to the other side, because they're not going to take it, right? They're not going to sign the agreement. So you've got to take a measured and reasonable approach with these types of things when you're trying to determine, what's a reasonable amount of liability and how much are they going to be willing to take on. If it's, if you're entering into a $300,000 agreement and you want to subject your vendor to, $10 million worth of liability for a data breach, it's probably not, an equivalent kind of risk that they're going to take on, right? I mean, the value of that contract's probably not worth the risk necessarily, but all that's negotiable and all that can be put into the agreement. And I think, going back to what Brad said earlier, and I think he said it very well, is that, the purpose of these contracts is really to come to an agreement as far as a meeting of the mind and set your expectations. And that's how I think you have to look at that conversation. It's not really a negotiation so much as it is a conversation. It's like, okay, and we expect you to do this. And they say, well, we really can't, and then you've got to figure out how to come together in the middle some way.
Excellent. Yeah. And this is more of a statement from our audience, but I'm going to go to you with this one, Eric, actually. And so have you ever worked with a client where their legal team might not understand kind of software, traditional language or deliverables or anything like that? And then how do you deal with that or recommend that they source another expert?
Yeah. So yeah, the comment I'll just show on the screen here while I'm answering it. But it's a really good point that leads to that question you asked, which is whether or not internal legal counsel can handle that. And in my opinion, I'd be curious to see what your thought is here. But internal legal counsel is going to be good at sort of your general terms and conditions and general protection of the company and general legal strategies that they're pursuing as an organization. But most internal legal counsels don't have a good understanding of where the pitfalls and nuances of these particular types of contracts are. Would you agree with that, Marcus, or have you seen otherwise?
No, I would agree with that. I mean, I think any attorney that negotiates, general commercial agreements is going to have an understanding generally, of course, of, a limitation of liability provision, an indemnity provision. Those types of things are pretty standard in almost all contracts. And I think most attorneys are going to have a feel for how the equity should play out when negotiating those types of terms and conditions. But, they're not going to understand what's market, so to speak, right? They're not going to understand what a vendor is reasonably going to agree to and what you should ask for. One of the easiest things to do, I think, is to take a contract, see what's right in front of you, and make changes to it based on what your perception of what is reasonable or unreasonable is. But what's harder is having an understanding of what to ask for, what's reasonable, and having an understanding of what is not there and what needs to be included in that contract. So I don't think your attorney necessarily has to have a deep dive understanding of the nature of the technology. They're not technologists necessarily, right? I mean, some attorneys are. They've got degrees in computer science and software related fields, and certainly that can be helpful. But they've got to have an understanding of the business environment and what's reasonable in the context of software integration, software development, and software implementation.
Yeah.
Excellent. Definitely. That sounds like it's super important when it comes to making sure that contract and that statement of work and just everything is aligned for expectations for the client or the customer. And then I just want to say for all of our panelists, feel free to jump in. I know, Brad, you have a wealth of knowledge on everything that it comes to these sort of processes. You surprised us last time when we talked about the cloud, and then you wanted to talk about culture. I don't think we've ever had anyone bridge that gap. So we're definitely excited to have all of these perspectives. We have a huge global audience today. It looks like all of our audience members are covered in snow, like us here in Denver in the United States. But we've got some Chicago, we've got Boston, Toronto, so a great international crew. And just a reminder to pop those questions or statements or feedback in the comments of wherever you're watching. So Brad, I want to transition to talk a little bit about the cloud. I think when we talk about something that's so intangible, sometimes it can be hard to visualize that. And I know in your first interview, you said the cloud is really someone else, a computer somewhere else. I think was how you defined it, and that was the best definition I've really ever heard. So I thought if you could kind of just give us some baseline of what is the cloud, and why has it become something that's such an emerging trend for 2022 when really it's been around for a little while?
Right, right. Yeah. So it was a bumper sticker I saw once from a techie, and it said the cloud, all it is someone else's computer. And for me, I always kind of start there. That's, of course, a very simplistic and kind of reductive explanation, but it gives you a certain set of context. So when I speak of the cloud, I'm speaking of the ability to have computing resources that are pooled from data centers. Ultimately, they're a collection of data center computers that are pooled together into a software layer to allow you to develop and build out computing architectures using other people's resources. And one of the biggest pieces that allows that and makes that so helpful is that the application layer that's provided by cloud providers, data center providers, for the immense scalability of resources. So it changes the old-fashioned notion of I have one device, that device has X amount of CPU and X amount of RAM and X amount of storage. And if I want to change those, I have to take this little thing and plug it in there, and hopefully there's another slot available to give me some more RAM or what have you. When you're talking about the cloud, now the idea of flexible, dynamic, scalable computing becomes a reality that says when my ecosystem isn't performing the way I need to, or I need to conversely change the way it's going to perform in the future to address upswings or downswings in computing needs, I can dial those in dynamically. So when you think of the cloud, it's like a hardware environment that is computer-based and dynamically configurable based on changing needs. That was a mouthful. I apologize ahead of time.
No problem. That's you do such an eloquent way of explaining the cloud. I think it's so helpful to a lot of our audience members that might not be incredibly familiar with that. So why do you think specifically right now it's become a really, really hot topic?
Oh boy, that's a great question. I'd say there's probably a couple of major reasons. The pandemic obviously has been helpful, right? I used to think about the Great Depression. So in the Great Depression, what happened? All consumption of goods and services fell, except in these very specific areas. What was one that rose? The refrigerator. So at a time when people's consumption of everything else was coming down, the refrigerator, oh my goodness, was this thing that took prominence in everyone's kitchens. Now, I wasn't there, so I can't tell you by my own anecdotal evidence, but that's what they tell me. And for me, the cloud has been kind of a similar thing in terms of the world circumstances of individuals being increasingly isolated due to all the things we've gone through over the last 2 years has made connectivity and accessibility over large potential expanses really important. So that's been one reason that cloud computing has taken off, is that companies have found that using a centralized provider to disseminate information to various access points or endpoints is much easier when it's coming from the cloud than it is coming from their own on-premise servers. Now, that takes you to the next point of security and safety, right? When you are an on-premise company, you're a manufacturer or a distributor, your daily business is not IT. You're not an IT firm. You're not a code shop. You are a distributor, a manufacturer. So your ability to defend yourself against all the attacks that come becomes much harder, especially when all these remote workers are now connecting into your network through a VPN or an RMM or some other form of connection strategy that increases the level of penetratability to your network. So that ability to take that and put it up in kind of a world-class data center where you have layer upon layer, of protection against those kinds of attacks has made the cloud, I think, a very viable candidate for a lot of people. As it is, software cycles so in general, an on-premise server. So, the general move to cloud has been from on-premise, old-fashioned local data centers to these cloud options, and average server has something like a 5-year sell by date. So you run it after 5 years, the processing time, the cost of maintaining it, the risk and such are such that you want to replace it. So as companies find themselves in that cycle of, okay, I have to replace this server, it's time to now figure out, now what do I do? Do I want to replace it with an on-premise, or do I want to jump to the cloud? And of course, there are a bunch of considerations there, one of them being staffing. So we've talked about, the great, there's a term for it, one of those industry terms, but the fact that we don't have enough workers, right? Every company I work for right now has the same problem. I can't find skilled workers. And this does not just include line workers, it includes people at all levels. I had a guy I know who was a network analyst during the pandemic. He quit and became a furniture manufacturer in his backyard, right? Okay, great, well, good for you, but now there's one less network analyst out there. So companies are finding, especially when they're located in sometimes remote areas, the ability to replace workers due to normal attrition becomes harder and harder. So as that happens, you start to think, now what layers of my organization can I replace or outsource with a cloud option, because I no longer have those capabilities. So what I find is folks are coming to us not because they're looking to do staff reductions, they're looking to catch up because they've already lost their staff and they're in a bind, and they say, okay, I need to move this into the cloud because Ned's off fishing, or Ned's building furniture, and he's not going to take care of my environment anymore. So I would say those are probably a handful of factors that in my mind are helping drive this movement.
Yeah, that's an excellent overview, and definitely very relevant. And I have another kind of relevant trending question for both of you in just a second, but I'm curious for our audience, do you have experience with the cloud? And if you can put a yes in the comment, a thumbs up, a cloud emoji, just so we know kind of who we're working with here, and see what that looks like. And then I'm going to get to another audience question. But we've talked a lot, specifically on our ground control podcast, about AWS, Amazon Web Services, and the outages that they've experienced. And I wonder, one, Brad, from just an overall process and logistics standpoint, if you are a business that's considering moving to an option such as the cloud or Amazon Web Services, how do you take that into consideration, that risk of possibly lost revenue if anything does go down, which some big businesses were really affected by that. Mm-hmm. And then my second question is going to be for Marcus about any sort of contracting when it comes to outages. So let's start with you, Brad.
Sure. So I would say, as a selection criteria, the deployment of your application in terms of where it's going to be deployed is often as important as the application itself. So if I were looking at cloud providers, it depends too on whether or not you're doing software as a service or platform as a service or infrastructure as a service. And I could give you all kinds of definitions and drown you in that. I'm going to try to save you the burden today. But depending on the type of service you're looking for and how much help you need, you could be entering the cloud at different levels, right? You could be working through a third-party cloud integrator like myself. So we don't own a data center. We use data centers from kind of your primaries, right? And then so that's one tier there. Another tier is you might have the internal networking resources that you'd work directly with AWS or Google or who's the other one? Who are those guys? Bill Gates? Never mind. But so you might find yourself working with one of the big three, or you might find yourself working with the family of data center out there that aren't part of the big three, but have sufficient architecture to support your needs. And each of those should be able to provide you, this is the reliability, kind of two things. This is the reliability contract that we will support, and this is historical evidence of how well we've kept to that contract. So for us, we don't actually work with the big three. One of our challenges was, customers coming to us wanted really minimal uptime. The only downtime they wanted was for natural software upgrades and such. And then you wanted the ability to, if you had to do shift across resources to obviate that. But we worked with a different company called US Signal, and they gave us a 100% uptime guarantee. And we've been working with them for 5 years, and we've never had that outage that cause that. So one of the questions that when you're talking about data centers is, are they too big to fail? Is their infrastructure so complex because they've gotten so large that they're not able to manage those performance levels that you would expect? And are there alternatives? Because I can speak from my own anecdotal firsthand that yes, there are. So I think that certainly is, you want contract on one side in terms of what their SLA, right? What's their service level agreement? And two, and you can get this online. There are whole, AWSoutages.com or what have you, where you can find what historically has actually happened, because people certainly are watching.
Very interesting. And Marcus, what are your thoughts on kind of protecting a business against that type of revenue loss?
Yeah, well, I think Brad kind of hits the high points, and I'll elaborate on those in a second. But I think Juiced in the comments, Juice Winnick, it brought up something. How much of this, cloud, kind of, why is it such a hot topic? Why are people moving towards the cloud, and how much of that is dependent on maybe how vendors push the cloud? And I think it really is vendor dependent to some extent. I mean, I think, we see it on a pretty regular basis. And I've been in this industry for 20 years, worked at some large software companies, and remember when things were, primarily on premise. And then there was this shift to the cloud, and something I call, cloud evangelism, where it's just the best thing for you. And it's not necessarily, the best thing for everybody. In your particular situation may be different. And I think vendors push it so much because there's economies of scale for it on their side, and it's incredibly profitable, right? I mean, there are 3-year terms. There's price increases on a regular basis. I mean, you're paying a monthly fee perpetually as long as you're in that term and it's been renewed. So I mean, the revenue generation associated with the cloud in some ways can be much higher than an old on-premise model. So I mean, it really does benefit the vendors, and as I think we all know, I mean, some of these systems that are touted as cloud systems aren't really fully baked, and they're not ready for prime time, which leads me into your question, Kyler. I mean, how do you protect yourself? And Brad brought it up. I mean, there's an element in these contracts called an SLA, which is a service level agreement, a service level obligation, which relates directly to uptimes. How often is that solution going to be down? Is it going to be down just for maintenance? Is it going to be down 90%, or excuse me, up 90% of the time, 95% of the time, 99.9? What's a reasonable ask as a customer? What should you expect? But more importantly, and to your point, how do you protect yourself? Well, what happens when they don't meet that agreed upon uptime guarantee? What do you get? Do you get a credit? Okay, well, what if it happens, they can't meet the uptime guarantee, more than 3 times in a month, for example, or during the term, or whatever you would negotiate? What happens because of that? What do you get out of it? And you've got to make sure you've got some real remedies associated with any failure to meet agreed upon uptimes. It can't just necessarily be, we'll give you some kind of an illusory credit, and that's it. I mean, you've got to go back into the limitation of liability provision in these contracts and make sure that it's got some real teeth. I mean, a lot of times you've got kind of a 2-tiered liability associated with this. You've got, your regular liability cap for something that happens under the contract, and then, if there's a series of events where these uptimes aren't met, you've got some sort of a super cap or some sort of lower cap associated with the kind of recovery that you can get because those uptime guarantees have not been met. So I think just having an understanding of what the responsibility is, what the guarantee is, and more importantly, what happens, what do you get if it's not met? You get money back? Do you get credits? Can you get out of the contract? All of those things need to be negotiated and made clear up front before you're in it.
Let me just jump in here real quick before you jump to the next question, because I mean, that was a great question about vendor push. How does vendor push affect cloud adoption? And let's answer the question in the most open kimono way fashion. Companies make money through valuation, right? Every company has M&A on their minds. Every company is valuated in software anyways. There's 3 core components of enterprise system costs. One is support, the cost that you're going to get for maintaining that software that you have to pay the vendor. One is licensure, the cost that you're going to pay to be able to use the software. The third is deployment, what you are going to pay to be able to stand that application up. Now, those 3 cost elements, you might have kind of an independent version or a dependent version. So an independent is for deployment. I buy my own server and I deploy it on my local premise, right? Or I put it into the cloud into a hosted environment where I still have access to the server. It's its own little piece, but I can work with it. That's one deployment option. Licensure, you're usually working with either a perpetual license or a subscription-based license. So perpetual, you buy it once, you own it once. Now with cloud, what vendors are moving towards is a model where the licensing is subscription-based, the support is subscription-based, and the deployment is subscription-based. If I could talk, these would be much better. But when you do that, you create an annuity for yourself as a company. So companies are very encouraged to have that, because if you say to a customer, you're not, or to a potential buyer, you're not just buying my company, you're buying all of these contracts that head out into the future. There's a lot of valuation that comes with that. So companies are naturally encouraged to try and drive up their valuation through the use of subscription services. I mean, I had a manufacturer of devices, and they say, we make devices, but we make the software that goes around that devices. And we're selling ourselves as a SaaS business, not really a device business. And that's kind of where the world has taken us, because everybody has M&A on the back of their minds. So when you're working with a vendor, you kind of have to ask that big question of how did this software naturally get made? Was this made as a on-premise version that was migrated to the cloud, or was it grown from the ground up as a cloud application? You know, with NetSuite, probably a great example, right? Built from scratch as a web-based SaaS application. You don't have that on-premise or private cloud option with it. No, there is no form of perpetual license in that model. So you're kind of going down one approach. For the customers that are in between that, and there are plenty of them, they have, and they will tout their SaaS version immensely, where the truth is their core product with all of the 20 years of development is this on-premise perpetually licensed version. And as a customer, you need to ask your vendor, what's the story of this, and what's the best way to deploy this? Because I've had customers who come to us frustrated by the SaaS version, which is the pure total cloud kind of hands-off model. And they're like, the sales engineers demonstrated the on-premise version, but then they sold me the SaaS version, and the two don't match. So you get this great sense of cognitive dissonance that comes from expectations being failing to be met because of that discrepancy. So I would say that coming out of the gate, that's a huge question you want to ask yourself: is what is the natural state of this application, and what are you trying to sell me? Because there could be some discrepancies there.
Yeah, that's excellent advice. And I want to come back to kind of those migration strategies that you're going to talk about at Digital Stratosphere. But Eric, I kind of want to go to you to get your opinion on how do you help businesses really kind of navigate this evolution when selecting a software, and really budget, like we talked about, for that software as a subscription type of model that it seems like is very valuable and coveted by businesses to really move to?
Yeah, so I think the first thing is just expectation setting and recognizing and getting it out of your mind that you're somehow going to save money by moving to the cloud. Yes, you're going to get rid of servers. Yes, you're going to maybe not have to have that network guy or gal, or whoever might be supporting your physical infrastructure. So there are some cost savings, but in general, you're not moving to the cloud, and most organizations aren't or shouldn't be moving to the cloud to save money in the long term. They should be doing it because of business value. It allows them to do work through a pandemic, for example. That's one example. So,
Sorry, we're having a hard
You fell
time
into a fishbowl, Eric.
Yeah,
There
you're
we go.
underwater.
Is that better?
Yes, please.
Okay, I didn't choose the right mic on here, so sorry about that. So I think that's the first thing, is really understand that there is a cost associated with the cloud, but presuming the value out of it, that might be okay as long as there's a positive ROI there. For some organizations, they don't really have a choice. They have to move to the cloud. It just doesn't make sense for them to be on-prem. So that might be a different story. But so that's the first thing. And then the second thing you really want to understand, back to Brad's point, which is a really good one, is if you're not looking at a native SaaS product like a NetSuite or a Workday or Salesforce, then you really want to poke holes and really understand the capabilities you're actually getting in the current cloud solution, because that's where a lot of people, for example, think, well, if I deploy, I'll just pick an example. If I deploy SAP S/4HANA in the cloud, surely it's going to have all the capabilities that SAP is known for, right? Because it's SAP. Well, it's not. S/4HANA is very different from ECC and R3 and some of those legacy on-prem systems where SAP had decades of R&D and product innovation and things that went into it. And you can't just flip a switch and say, okay, we're in the cloud now with S/4HANA and overnight have that same capability. It's going to take years for S/4HANA to catch up to where ECC and R3 were. Now, on the flip side of that, there are certain capabilities that you get in the cloud that you couldn't get, or that would be a lot harder to get with on-prem. Like when you think about analytics and machine learning, Internet of Things, some of that stuff, that's a lot harder to do in an on-premise environment than it is in the cloud. So there are some certainly capabilities that you sort of get an immediate lift from, or maybe an immediate advantage. But there's going to be other areas, particularly outside of your core, call it your core vanilla ERP stuff like financials, inventory management, et cetera. Once you get outside of that and start to look at advanced demand planning or product lifecycle management, for example, that's where those outer edges of ERP, that's where you find a lack of maturity oftentimes in the cloud because they just haven't had time to develop all those capabilities yet. So I think the key is to go in with a bit of healthy skepticism to say, okay, I'm moving to the cloud. I'm deploying this cloud solution or cloud version of a former on-premise system. So I need to poke holes and understand what I'm losing, because you are losing something. You just need to understand what. And you're also gaining too, of course. So you want to understand what you're gaining as well.
Absolutely. That professional skepticism that we created a new buzzword. Yes. So you're welcome, Internet. We're just so excited about it. At our last
podcast episode. I think every podcast episode we invent a new buzzword.
Yes. I'm a buzzword fan. Eric's not. So it's a good balance. You know,
you do it to trigger.
I think that's incredible. I mean, and that's a takeaway that I think my clients really need to understand, is to have that, professional skepticism, I think is the word you use, Kyler, but, poking holes in it, because, it's just a matter of fact that these sales teams, I mean, they're compensated excessively for selling the software. I mean, I've done the discovery, I've seen the documents, I've certainly, been inside that kimono many, many times. These guys make a ton of money off of the software that they're selling you. And what do they sell you? They sell you the sizzle most times, right? And you think you're getting a filet mignon and you're getting some round chuck. I think, that's how lawsuits are made, right? When they sell you or show you, demonstrate to you the on-premise version, sell you the cloud, and now you've made all these assumptions that the cloud version is going to function in a substantially similar way as that on-premise version, and it just doesn't. You've got processing times of 12 seconds for every transaction in the system, and you're wondering why. That's not what I was shown. I mean, that's when people knock at my door and they're ready, to go guns blazing in a massive piece of litigation that's going to cost millions of dollars. So you've got to do the due diligence on the front end, and you've got to poke those holes, and you've got to ask the questions, and you can't make any assumptions, especially when you're a manufacturer or distributor and that's not your primary business, software.
Yeah, the other part of that too is, in addition to what you said, Marcus, and sort of building on what Brad said, is that you also have to look at the flexibility that you might be losing, especially if you're deploying a SaaS-based solution. So if you're going from, say, AS400 mainframe custom system where your organization is used to getting exactly what you want, your IT department's just going to go give you what you want because they can go customize the software and do their thing that you can do with on-prem. If you're going from that kind of an environment to a SaaS environment, that's a culture shock. I mean, all of a sudden you're saying you're going to lose all that customization, which may be the best thing longer term, by the way. But in the short term, it's going to create culture shock because now people are going to be told that, hey, I can't get what I want. I have to use the software the way it was built. And again, that's, for a lot of organizations, that is the best thing longer term because there's no point in recreating the wheel for a lot of these capabilities. But it creates a disruption to the business in the short term because people are so used to having exactly what they want. And then they start to resist the change because now they say, now they see that, I can't get my reports the exact way I want them, or the button that I want on this screen isn't on that screen and I can't put it there. And IT's telling me I can't put it there either. That's where the resistance comes from. So you've just got to be ready to invest heavily in change management, even more so than you would otherwise for any sort of transformation, even more so if you're making that big leap from an on-prem custom system to a SaaS solution.
Yeah, and you've really got to think about that and account for it to the extent you can in the contract, right? I mean, you can't necessarily account for all of what you just said, But here's an example. I was talking to an in-house attorney at a large clothing retailer, not a retailer, manufacturer. They actually manufacture the item of clothing, and some of you are probably wearing that item of clothing today. And they were moving to a SaaS environment, and they wanted to make sure that the upgrade schedule for that SaaS product wasn't going to be during the holidays when they had their busiest, retail season. So if you've got some major upgrade or update to the software that occurs, right during December when you're going to have this massive sales push and you've got to get all your products, it could potentially impact your ability to do that. So I mean, you've got to account for that loss of control and try to get back as much of it as you can. The goal of a licensee, and that's what you're even in a SaaS environment, you're a licensee, is to get all of the indicia of ownership that you would as if you actually own that software as much as you can. You want the flexibility and the capability to control how you use that software. And you give a lot of that up in that SaaS environment. You just do.
Well, excellent. Well, you guys don't even need me here, right? You're just going for it, which is so great. And that's what Digital Stratosphere is. So before we wrap up here at the top of the hour, Brad, I want you, if you can, your keynote is called Cloud Migration Strategies, Lift and Shift versus Build from Scratch. Can you just give us kind of a sneak peek as to what does that mean?
Sure. The Cliff Notes version. So I'm speaking within a specific space inside of cloud. We've spent a lot of time today talking about SaaS, which is essentially vendor managed cloud applications. At a kind of a lower level, there's a whole world of private cloud architectures that allow customers to have an amount of control and access to their applications and the underlying architecture within a perpetual licensed, non-subscription based format. And for us, we're talking about that specifically because that's kind of the meat of our business at the Estes Group, is moving folks off of an on-prem, or even we're moving folks out of SaaS right now into a private cloud, and talking through what those implications are. So when you talk about a move into a cloud architecture, you have a couple of options, and they can most simply be described as a build from scratch or lift and shift. And so lift and shift is where you take an existing image of your computer that you have physically, and you take an image of that and you shift that into the cloud. And that most of the basic things, properties of that computer stay the same: computer name, protocols. Sometimes you can keep a lot of the links to other applications without having to reconfigure them, and you just kind of lift it and you shift it. And so other than maybe the IP address changing, pretty much everything else stays the same. So build from scratch is kind of the opposite, where you take the server that you need and you build it up from the bottom up. So instead of just dropping on a layer, you come and you configure all the different layers, whether it's the database, the application server, the operating system, Active Directory, all those pieces, you build them up from scratch. So they're two very different ways of doing this, and they have different proper uses, different implications, risks, depending on an abundance of factors. So those will be the things I'll be chatting on when Stratosphere comes around.
That's excellent. Well, we're very excited to hear that information. Obviously, we have a big audience that's very interested in the cloud and specifically migration strategies. So just a reminder to the audience, Brad is actually speaking on the 10th. So feel free to join us live and ask questions, as he will be there as well. So Marcus, let's go over to you. Your keynote is very broad, right? Contracting and digital transformation. Is there anything specific that you'd like our audience to know that you'll be covering?
Yeah, I mean, look, the benefit and what I want you to get out of my presentation is really to have an understanding of the contracting process from a kind of a overarching view, and then have a real understanding of the most important provisions in those agreements that you really need to focus on, and not just from a legal perspective, because I think, like we talked about today, that's somewhat easy to do, right? But it's those things that you really need to focus on as a business to get the most flexibility out of that relationship that you have with the vendor for the life cycle of your use of that product. I mean, things like defining appropriately defining the software. What are you licensing, right? What can you do with it? Understanding how you're going to be billed. What's the license metric? if I have a third-party piece of technology hook in and communicate with the software, am I getting charged for that? Does that count against my user metric? Those are the bigger scope kind of things that I want to address, because I think the contracting process is important from a nuts and bolts perspective, but those are the bigger things that you've got to think about that you can address in that contracting process that actually mitigate risk and save you money over the long haul.
Excellent. Well, that's going to be such important insight. You're getting free legal advice to your team. So make sure that you bring your questions for Marcus as well during the event. Again, go to www.stratosphere2022.com or visit our Third Stage website to register. It's a completely free event, jam-packed 3 days with great insights. And we're so grateful to our excellent sponsors, Estes Group and Taft Law, for joining us today. So thank you, everyone. We hope you have a great weekend wherever you are in the world. And we will see you next week on the 8th for Eric's keynote that kicks off our Digital Stratosphere conference. Thanks so much, Marcus and Brad and Eric, for joining us today. And thank you, audience. We will see you next time.
Yeah, thank you very much, everybody. Looking forward to it.
Yep, likewise. Have a good weekend.
Take care.